Welcome to the Developmental, a podcast about the messy, beautiful ways grown-ups grow up. Here, we explore turning the science into the day-to-day practice of adult development in teams, homes, organizations, and life. Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Developmental. As those of you who listen to this podcast or read my articles probably already know, the topic of walking the talk, the capacity to be the person you are asking or raising, coaching, teaching others to be, is very important to me. I believe it's crucial to walk the talk in many contexts, but particularly so in professions where the very focus of our work is supporting others' growth. Therapists, coaches, facilitators all have, I believe, a big responsibility in doing the work of development for themselves, just as they do it with their clients. Scaffolds like mentoring and supervision go a long way to keeping us honest and evolving, but so do our own efforts, day in and day out. But what do those efforts look like? What does it actually mean to embody the work? In this episode, I explore these very questions with my dear friend and fellow coach, Priya Ahuja. I've met Priya in a context where I was a newcomer, entering an established group of long-time coaches of which she was part. From the get-go, I was touched by her authenticity, integrity, openness, and generosity in helping me feel right at home in that high-stakes environment. Over the years, we have become close friends, and I have learned so much from her on the art of coaching, but also on the art of being a wise human being. To me, Priya is a coach who walks the talk, and I have invited her to unpack what that means for her. What is the inner work she's doing to keep herself honest, aware, and to cultivate within herself the wisdom she is striving to support in her clients? A little bit about Priya. She brings more than 2 decades of experience at McKinsey & Company as a leader supporting individual and institutional transformation. She now works for herself as a leadership coach and facilitator. She also mentors coaches seeking to further develop their capacities. Priya supports senior leaders across the globe on tailored individual leadership journeys anchored in their current strengths, helping them realize and live into their full potential. She facilitates large-scale leadership transformation programs locally and globally, working simultaneously at the individual and group levels to support leaders, executive teams, and organizations to more skillfully navigate the extreme turbulence emblematic of the current global environment. Priya's coaching and facilitation is informed and supported by leading-edge thinking and practices in the field of adult development, systems leadership and change, and the human potential movement. Her own experience of growing up, living, and working in 4 countries across 3 continents has also shaped her approach to coaching, facilitation, and mentoring, as she brings this rich diversity of lived experiences in her work. Priya is a certified integral master coach. She holds a master's degree in organizational psychology and a master's degree in international relations. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Priya. And we're on.
Beautiful.
Welcome, Priya. Welcome to the Developmental.
Thank you so much, Alice. It's such a privilege to be on this podcast with you. So thank you for having me.
And it's such a joy to bring one of our beautiful conversations out into the light and invite other people in. I'm very, very happy to have you here, and I can't wait to explore a lot of shadows and lights and nuances of this work we both love and do, which is coaching in different ways.
Absolutely. I'm so looking forward to having this conversation with you and yeah, just, hopefully shining the light in ways that will help some of your listeners. And I hope us too, as we go through this podcast, that we continue to learn and grow and discover from each other.
Yeah, I often think that I'm doing these out of a fundamentally selfish reason because I learn so much every single time. So I have no doubt this will happen again today. I'll give a bit of context to
Mm-hmm.
how we met and how this topic of doing and being the work we are doing as coaches came
Beautiful.
about in our initial conversations. So
Mm-hmm.
we met, I believe, close to almost 5 years ago now. I don't know where time has gone. In a program that I was researching for my PhD, and you were part of the faculty as one of the coaches supporting that cohort of leaders
Mm-hmm.
I was studying. And I remember being struck by how, and we're going to be using this word quite a bit, and maybe we'll need to define it, but how embodied you were, how you were embodying what I believe to be just the spirit of coaching and of collaboration and of dialogue. And I remember that being my first thought when I met you. Oh, this is a woman who walks the talk, and I love just listening to her and learning from her. And you embodied that in, the way you welcomed me into that community, the way you supported me throughout. So I believe that I have a lot to learn from you about what it means to just be the work that you're doing. So, yeah.
Wow. I'm just noticing one, just appreciation for what you're sharing, and that little bit of discomfort as well.
Let it sink in, let it sink
Just
in.
letting it, yeah, just letting it sink in right now. And yeah, no, I'm so glad that that was your experience, and I'm looking forward to sharing the journey that brought me to where I am, and which is taking me, I'm not sure where, but I'm enjoying being on this journey because it's really fulfilling, and I like to share what it's brought into my life and how that might serve perhaps some of your listeners, especially people who are in this developmental coaching and facilitation space.
Yeah. So maybe let's start there, Priya.
Mm-hmm.
What you've been coaching for a long time, and I know you
Mm-hmm.
have a deep, deep love and passion for this craft. And I know you're treating it as much more than just a craft, which is what we're going to explore. But can you share a bit? How did you come to it? What brought you into this space of coaching and then of integral coaching and practice? What was the
Yeah.
journey?
I mean, thank you for that question. It's a story I don't often tell, but I've always been a student of the mind, and the psyche. It's just I've been a lifelong learner in this space. I can still recall when I first discovered psychology as an undergrad student, and I just knew I'd found my passion and I'd found my calling, right? It caused me to make this massive pivot from, I was enrolled at that point to be an undergrad honors in mathematics.
Really? I
And
didn't know that.
I pivoted to an undergrad honors in psychology. That's just how much I knew. I didn't know about psychology till then. And it was just hearing about this discipline. I've always wanted to work with people. And this felt like a pathway that resonated quite deeply with me. But, oddly, paradoxically, the more I studied, the less I felt I knew.
Mm.
And, right through my undergrad and my graduate studies in psychology, and even in my early years working in the organizational transformation space, there was always this sense that something was always missing for me. And so, maybe here's an example. I was in my first job with the boutique sort of org transformation change management firm. We did work with lots of blue chip clients, and I was lucky to, as part of that, stumble across the work of people like Juran and Deming and other pioneers of the total quality movement. And I'm talking now about the late 1980s, okay? And seeing this whole other way of leading people and working with people that all of my background and studies in org psych just hadn't exposed me to, and so off I went to Japan.
Mm.
Because that's where this work originally came from. And I enrolled in a second master's in Japanese studies and international management, really to try and learn more about this way of working and how it could apply beyond Japan. Like what was magical about this style of leadership. But even that had a sense of incompleteness to it, and it was only when I, at some point in the early 90s, I think, stumbled across the writings of Ken Wilber, an integral theory, that I finally came to understand that every one of these approaches that I had learned and studied about, all approaches to growth and development, they were all really valid in their own rights, and they were also partial. That there was no real approach that was all-encompassing of the complexity that defines reality.
Yeah.
And for me, that whole idea of rightness and partiality, holding something as right and partial, that was such a big aha moment for me, right? And sort of an invitation to kind of explore and integrate as many approaches and perspectives as I could realistically play with, to keep refining that meta map I was working with around growth and development. Not with the expectation that I would cover all my bases, but really just to keep broadening and enriching that map I was working with, so that I had more ways of understanding and more ways of interpreting the workings of the psyche, of the mind, and more ways of responding to whatever might be emerging as I worked with individuals and I worked with groups. And that then led me to train as a coach with Integral Coaching Canada, because I found that that was a school that was very anchored in this approach. And then, of course, I was very lucky to have the opportunity to apply what I was learning and exploring, especially when I served for over a decade as an in-house coach, working with, tenured consultants and partners and clients for a global firm. And that's how we met on one of the leadership programs. And it's an approach I continue to work with now in how I work with my clients. And I'm working to myself now, but this idea of really, working with a deeper, more refined, more textured map that allows us to really bring more diverse understandings and many more varied interpretations of what might be going on, so that we can increasingly meet clients, hopefully, where they are.
Yeah. Wow, there are so many avenues I'd love to go, but the first question that is just sitting there in my mind, and I'll just say it, is what was it in you, like in your experience, in the things you cared about in your own life, that fueled that curiosity, that I want to learn about this, but it's not enough, and it's true and partial. What do you feel has been a driver of that search for you?
That's a really interesting question. I think that maybe some of it's coming from perhaps a sense that there was not a stickiness to the transformation, that I would perhaps, or the work I was doing, where was the stickiness? Like, how do you create sustainable transformation?
So seeing the change being embedded and kind of becoming sustainable, which isn't happening that often.
Yeah, you will find that it happens for a while, but then things relapse, or
people go back to their just old ways.
That's it. And how can you actually serve sustainable transformation and change in an individual, in a group of individuals, and as part of that, also starting to tune into, hey, how am I growing, right, in a way that is sustainable? How am I evolving in a way that is truly reflecting and embodying what some of the maps suggest I should be embodying,
Yep.
How am I bringing more congruence between what the maps of growth and change and evolution are suggesting should be present and the territory I'm actually inhabiting, the ways in which I'm actually showing up? Where's the congruence between those two? And how do I actually find ways to make those more congruent?
Yeah.
Does that
So would
sound?
it, yeah, it does make sense. And I'm wondering if it would be fair to say that when we say embodying, we mean an alignment between, what you're thinking is the right thing to do, feeling is the right thing to do, and what you're actually then doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as sort of developmental coaches and facilitators, we're sort of quite often drawn quite naturally to sort of explore the workings of the mind and to want to make more sense of how our minds work, how we tick, how our clients tick. And, frameworks, models, these can it's anything that can cast more light on this terrain that has real allure for us. But I think we really want to develop and build that capacity to discern perhaps when we're over-indexing or over-identifying with these frameworks and these models. Because ultimately, a model or a framework is just that. It's an abstraction of reality, right? And by its nature, it will be reductionist in some way.
Yeah.
It can't really capture the dynamism, of reality or the complexity of the human being, the complexity of the human psyche, the complexity of any given individual, because we're all different. So I think we want to, as developmental coaches, we want to really invest in continuing to learn and know more models, more maps, refine our maps. And we also want to kind of really be able to not unconsciously substitute our maps for the territory that we're inhabiting as human beings. We want to be able to kind of tease that apart.
Yeah. So knowing that our models and our frameworks and our stages and all the other concepts we work with in this space are just constructs really to help us make sense, but they're not the thing.
They're not the thing. They're not the territory we inhabit, right? And so what is the territory we inhabit, right? And I think starting to do that work, if we really want to do this work, then starting to understand for ourselves as developmental coaches, well, what is the territory I inhabit? You know, starting to really unpack my identity as a coach. Is that some way that you think will be useful to go? Oh, I'm happy.
Yeah, I'd love to explore that. And I'd love to, because I know you've lived through so many instances of maybe facing this within yourself. Am I actually inhabiting the territory? So I wonder if there's any story maybe that comes to mind where you might have, faced your own attachment to a map, maybe, or kind of challenged your own mindset and went, look, this is actually just a map, but here's the territory, and this is what I need to do to actually inhabit the territory, as you so beautifully said. What does that look like?
I mean, that's a really beautiful question. So, I think that if I imagine I'm with a client who has a reputation for being a challenging leader, and I'm now in this really sensitive conversation with this individual. I'm doing everything the maps suggest I should do. I'm kind of holding up the mirror to this individual, inviting them to tune into who they're being. And I'm getting pushback. I'm getting disagreement. And now I'm being challenged in that moment, in that conversation. And I noticed that I'm not able to show up and stay in that conversation. I want to take away the discomfort of being in that challenge.
Yeah. So you don't want to feel the conflictual nature of that conversation or the aggression of the client that's coming your way or any of that stuff.
Yeah. And then I start to notice what I'm doing then. How, am I placating? Am I, how am I taking the conversation forward?
Mm.
And then I start to notice after the conversation, the voice of self-criticism.
Mm-hmm.
I should have been able to do that. Because something in my coaching identity has me anchored on this map that I'm using at a level of development that is not in congruence with the territory I was inhabiting in that conversation.
Yeah.
My map tells me I should have been able to regulate my emotions. I should have been able to stand in my power. I should have been able to, ask powerful questions. Whatever it is that my map tells me I should have been able to do, I was not able to do. And I noticed the voice of self-criticism.
Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that voice when you hear it?
Interestingly, this is one of the things that I started working on quite early in my coaching career is developing a capacity for self-acceptance.
Mm.
And the minute I use self-acceptance with some individuals, I find that their meaning making might be around, oh, you're asking me to be mediocre. No, I'm not asking you to be mediocre, right? I'm asking you to build the capacity to accept exactly where you are now, knowing that from that place of where I am now, I will continue to grow and I can invite myself to continue to grow. And I know that I'm on this journey and I can really savor the journey I'm on.
Yeah. I was going to actually, that was exactly the question that popped into my mind because I have heard this statement made in response to, maybe the value of cultivating self-acceptance and the responses. So then that's complacency, right? That's if you accept, then you settle for what is, and what is not good enough. Then what you're saying is notice when you're falling back, as Valerie Livesay would probably say, when you've behaved in a way that is not congruent with the maturity you're capable of.
That's it.
And then you're noticing that critical voice kind of starting to tear apart what you've done and kind of getting into that critical stance. But then you bring self-acceptance to that, not as a way to just ignore what happened or let it go, but as a way to what's the nuance there for you? What does self-acceptance, when it's paired up with a genuine desire to continue growing, what does that do?
So I think that let's unpack that a little bit. So if I were to sort of, how do I anchor in self-acceptance in a way that is skillful, in a way that invites me to grow? Perhaps, and this is true for me, but every coach has to find their own pathway through this, right? And my invitation would be that you experiment and you keep experimenting till you find pathways that work for you. But for me, I know that the self-critic is a voice that can show up. And over the years, because I've been working and practicing with engaging with this voice skillfully, it's not as pervasive now, but it's still there. It's never going away. And so how do I kind of accept that rather than sort of, giving into the voice of the self-critic, how do I invite myself to accept that, where I am, who I was able to be in that conversation, in that context, that was exactly where I needed to be. And that was exactly where I needed to be because it's shining a light on what else I need to embody. Where else how can I continue to grow in a way that allows me to be in that kind of a challenging context more skillfully?
Right. So you look at that moment as something that might have been unpleasant, but then it was at the same time an opportunity to see the growth that you
That's
can
it.
actually engage in that you would not
That's
have
it.
seen otherwise.
That's it. I don't want to push it under the carpet. My invitation is to see what else can I, what was I unable to embody in that moment that perhaps I needed to develop the capacity to embody. So I might find, for example, that maybe as I explore that question, I might find that, what I noticed was how much I was engaging in that moment from my head, from trying to be logical or trying to be rational. And what I was not engaging enough from was my heart. And that can then give me an opportunity to consider, well, what's a practice I can bring online that allows me to bring my heart into these conversations,
Right.
some more than I would have otherwise. Right?
Yeah. So you would turn that reflection into some sort of then concrete experiment you can try next time you're in a similar situation.
That's it. Right? And when my heart's online, then what becomes more possible for me, perhaps when my heart's online, I'm sort of fast forwarding this and I'm probably pulling on lots of different instances to sort of create this example, as it were. But when my heart's online, maybe I find that actually I can tune in more to my own interiority and at the same time also remain present to my client's interiority. What's happening in the interpersonal space for me, what's happening in their interpersonal space for them, what's the interpersonal behavior they're displaying at that moment, what's the interpersonal behavior I'm displaying in that moment. Am I displaying more giving, and are they displaying more taking? I'm just making this up, but we want to start, what's happening in my emotional space for me, what's happening in their emotional space for them. Really start to tease apart what is playing out in this interaction that is me, what is the territory I'm actually inhabiting, what is the territory my client is inhabiting, and being able to hold both of those things side by side, developing that capacity to be present to both. And it's not something that's going to happen in a single conversation, but this is something you keep chipping away at and just developing more and more skill with, such that, there is congruence in who you're being and you're meeting your client where they need to be met. And you're able to stay with that. You're able to accept that this is how it's going to be. And I'm going to be able to just sit with this now. And rather than close or placate or move forward in some way, I'm going to stay with this conversation and continue to offer some things. Maybe I help the client be more accepting of what's coming up for them. I offer a frame that might help them kind of normalize what they're experiencing in that
so
moment.
you might reflect back at them, the way they're angry towards you and, what that means for them and what's happening for them.
That's it.
Rather than just trying to placate and kind of soothe that uncomfortable feeling.
That's it, right? So how do I offer presence what's happening in that interpersonal dynamic, in the space between us, into that conversation? Maybe if my heart's more online, I'm also able to tune into what's not being said by the client, by me, and how do I bring that into the conversation, right? And then from there, how do I offer something that continues to take us forward constructively? What sorts of powerful questions can I ask in that moment that allows us to continue with this conversation in a way that is helpful for the client?
And I'm loving this this example, and it's making me think of something you mentioned before we started the recording around how when you're doing this type of self-reflective work constantly as a coach, where you go, am I just talking about my models here, or am I actually walking my talk.
Mm-hmm.
You said you become the instrument
That's it.
of your own work. And I'd love you to say a bit more about that. What does that mean for you to be the instrument? And I do believe that this idea extrapolates to other areas. I think in education, teachers are often the instrument of their work in the classroom, or leaders. It's the being of the leader that actually makes a huge impact on the team rather than what the leader knows. And in parenting, I'm thinking of, my own experience as a mother. It's how I am in relation to my child that often I see as creating the biggest impact rather than what I just say. And when my words are incongruent with my actions, she'll pick it up immediately. So I'd love us to explore a bit this idea of, what does it mean to be the instrument of whatever work you happen to be doing in that moment, be it coaching or teaching or leading or raising kids or whatever other instances where you do have an impact on other people's lives or growth.
Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful phrase, and it was, the first time I ever came across it was when I was going through my coaching certification, this notion of self as instrument. And it's something that's really stuck with me because, like you were saying, it's so important to sort of tease apart, are we over-relying on tools and frameworks? And is that over-reliance causing us to be blind to who we're actually being in that moment? Is there congruence between the tools and frameworks and maps that we're using in the moment and we're teaching from, or we're parenting from, and who we're actually able to be in that moment? And how do we kind of bridge that? And, self as instrument might be a way of bringing more congruence between those two, or developing self as instrument. I think there are several different ways in which people describe this here. So I'm going to give you what is sort of my lived experience of self as instrument. And I think it's really being, the more you can develop self as instrument, the more present you can be to who you are being. For me, self as instrument is really about continuing to cultivate that deeper awareness of where am I playing from in any given moment, really being present to that. What's my default meaning making that's happening for me in any given moment? And how do I deploy that to kind of make meaning of what is actually happening in this moment?
So it would be almost asking yourself, how am I actually showing up? What am I doing? What am I saying? What's my energy in this conversation? Like checking in on all of those facets of being, of showing up in a moment, and seeing, is this aligned with, what I say or I think is the mature approach in a situation like this?
Yeah. I mean, maybe if we use an example to bring it alive, and we can play with a couple of different examples if you think that'll help. I'm thinking about something like active listening.
Yep.
Every coach knows that's like a foundational capacity that we know we have to embody in our interactions with clients. And I'm just holding this, but we can extrapolate like to parenting, to teaching, and all these other domains that we play in. But how do I know I'm embodying active listening? And I think that am I, as a coach, I've read everything that exists out there on this topic. I've done a whole lot of tests that tell me I have the capacity to be pretty good at this. I got this beautiful map of what it means to show up in a way that, demonstrates active listening. But when I'm in the conversation with the individual, have I developed the capacity to really tune into listen such that I can hear my own internal voice while I'm also listening to my client? And I can tell when my internal voice is biasing me to offer solutions. You know, am I building the capacity to tell when my body is tensing up and wanting to really hurry the pace of the conversation? You know, am I building my capacity to sense, as we were saying earlier, into that subtext of what my client is saying? What's being left unsaid?
Yep.
And am I building the capacity to ask really powerful questions that can continue to help us find a way forward?
Yeah. And just to add to that, I'm noticing as a coach, when I am truly listening, what we call powerful questions tend to be almost instinctual. They fall out of me and they're always really threaded into what the client is giving me. I don't feel like in those moments of deep listening, I have to think about what question to ask. And that for me is a good indicator I'm actually listening. And the opposite, when I find that my mind goes, oh, what's the next best question here? I'm no longer there. Yeah. And it also brought something else up from a different domain of life. And almost I'm feeling the guilt as I'm sitting here and listening to you describe what it means to be the instrument when it comes to active listening. A feedback my now almost 8-year-old gave me when she was about 5. And she was telling me something about her day at kindy, and I was half listening. But I was there. I wasn't doing anything else. Physically, I wasn't, but mentally, I was half listening. And that's a generous description of my level of presence in that moment. And she suddenly stopped and looked at me and she said, "Mommy, you're not here. You're not hearing me." And it just, it struck me in the core how she picked it up and called me out on it. Because, outwardly, I was physically there. I wasn't checking my emails. I wasn't doing anything overtly to show that I wasn't really being the listener that she needed me to be. So I think there's something to be said about how others pick up on us being in that embodied state you're describing.
Yeah, when we don't show up with that embodiment, it is, and this is the lack of congruence, right, that others experience between who we say we're being and who we're actually being. And that's such a beautiful example with your daughter, and she felt safe to give you that feedback. And one of the concerns I have is who else gives us feedback, especially in our professional role as coaches, who can hold the mirror back to us? There's an ethical obligation for us to really be investing in this work, because we might get feedback from other domains of our life, but how often do we get feedback from our clients? And so how do we continue to invest in ways that allow us to really be congruent? And this is the thing, right? Because if we kind of don't do the work ourselves, and this is, so, we were talking about this earlier in the conversation, why did I feel like I had to keep exploring and playing and kind of finessing what I'm doing here? It's because we might kind of fall short in helping our clients inhabit the territory that they long to inhabit. And they're in this work with us because they're inhabiting a territory that doesn't work for them anymore. And they know that. And they're saying, help me get to where, a territory that's more fulfilling. Help me really inhabit that fully. Now, if we are not embodying where we're living, if we have not really a full understanding of the territory we're inhabiting, if we're not then doing the work that allows us to inhabit the territory of being an effective developmental coach, how can we then do really effective work with our clients?
Yeah. So would you say there is a direct link between the efforts we're making to keep ourselves as coaches honest, awake, aware,
facing our behaviors, which we might not like to see, like doing all of that uncomfortable work. Is there a link between us doing that and us being more effective in supporting others' growth? And the opposite, like what happens if we don't do that work? Are we less effective in helping them?
I mean, I can only speak to my experience, and for me, there is a direct correlation.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that, if we aren't working with being more and more embodied, with sort of being able to tune into our interiority, being able to tune into the interpersonal space between us and our clients, being able to kind of really tune into the context in which we are working with ourselves and our clients, and being able to develop capacities that then allow us to coach from that greater embodied awareness. We might run the risk of feeling like we have taken our clients where they want to go simply because they now get the maps that we're working with. They understand what it means they know what it means to inhabit that terrain. Mm-hmm. But we might not really give them the tools and the practices to fully inhabit that terrain. So they might go.
So we might transfer the theory, but not really model the practice.
That's it. And so they'll then go away and, some of them will have the capacities already. We don't know, right? Because we haven't really explored that space with them. And they might do just fine. Others might struggle with really inhabiting that territory. Some others might inhabit it for a while, but then something happens in their lives that causes them to regress. But because there's been no conscious practicing and developing of these capacities that are required to inhabit that space, the emotional capacity, the interpersonal capacity, the cognitive capacity, the moral capacity, they might find that they don't know how they could play in that space earlier, but they're not playing there anymore. Yeah. And they don't know how to get back there.
So no, sorry.
Yeah.
You go.
No, you go.
No, I was almost reflecting on almost on a day-to-day, because it's so interesting, this type of work. It resonates when you talk about it, and then when we get into the nitty-gritty of it, it's so hard to actually do. So I'm wondering, what are and I'm happy to share a couple of mine, these kinds of practices, like very practical small things that you can do to train that muscle of embodiment. Let's say if embodiment were a muscle, there are, ways to train it, and people have their own ways to do that. And I think there's a universe of practices out there, but I'd love us to explore a little bit what are, your own, and maybe mine as well, and maybe just, throw a bit of inspiration at people to consider what might be theirs. How do you keep yourself honest? How do you keep yourself walking the talk? How do you keep yourself growing as a professional and as a human being? And for me, two things come to mind that I have had a huge impact in my own growth. And one is a personal practice, and that is journaling, which I've been doing since I was 16, and revolting against my parents and kind of wanting to keep an account of my evolving self, lest I forget when I get to their age. I was convinced that there's this weird amnesia that grown-ups are, afflicted by, that makes them just genuinely forget that they were teenagers once, and felt like there's no way they can not get me to the extent that they're not getting me, unless they just forgot, because they must have been my age, and I know they were my age. So that was my prompt for journaling, and it's just been such a life-changing exercise to reflect on my day, on where I messed up or what brought me joy. It can be anything, but it's a constant mirror. I find that I'm very honest with myself when I write. And the other one is the truth tellers, as I call them, the few people in life who call out my BS, and they're just love me and I love them, and they're not afraid to just tell it as is and just call out when I'm not like my daughter did. She's growing up to be quite a truth teller in my life. But yeah, I've got a few good friends and my partner and her just, calling me out on stuff. And these two simple things are making just such a huge difference for me.
Yeah. Beautiful.
So yeah, wondering what are yours? What do you do?
Gosh, I mean, I have lots of different things that I'm practicing, but I want to just step back for a moment. And before I sort of share what it is that I'm practicing, maybe just, because I think that one of I love your two practices, like journaling. I remember right through coach certification being asked to journal. And it's not something that I practice in a deliberate and daily way now, but I will record ahas that come up for me and why they come up for me. And I will, kind of make a note of when I'm in a practice, when something kind of unlocks what's happening in that. So, it's a bit episodic, but it still serves me.
Same for me. Not every day, but when it counts.
Yeah. Beautiful. Right. And but one of the things that I wanted to just step back and share about practices is that we want to also develop a certain amount of skill in how we define a practice and how we scale a practice. So we're not trying to develop muscle by practicing in our most challenging moments. We're actually finding a way to practice when things are, not comfortable, but starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable, but not in the moment when, that I think that.
So don't make it a crisis, like a crisis intervention, these kinds of practices. Make it a habit when life is good and you're at your best, you're still practicing. Is that what you're saying?
Well, not necessarily when life is good, because it's kind of hard to have the motivation to practice then. But how are we starting to find ways of practicing, coming out of a coaching conversation, kind of just reflecting on, how did that conversation go? If I think about who I was being, if I think about my identity as a coach, what was I noticing? What did I believe my role was meant to be in that conversation? What were some ideas or approaches or theories that maybe that I'm seeing owned me, that I was really loyal to, and that was shaping what I could do, who I could be in that conversation. How was I sort of noticing how I'm making meaning of that conversation? Was it a good conversation? Was it not a good conversation? Right?
Yeah.
And maybe and so really starting to unpack my I amness as a coach, and what are the anchors of that I amness, and I might notice that, I kind of noticed that I'm feeling really good coming out of this conversation because the client validated what was happening in that conversation for them. They walked away with this sense that it was an amazing conversation. I want to notice that that's really important to me. And I want to notice what happens when that's not present for me in a conversation.
When you don't have that validation.
When I don't have that validation, right? And then I kind of notice, the muscle, therefore, that perhaps I need to bring more online is a capacity to self-validate.
Yeah.
That capacity to be able to really bring my best to the conversation, but then de-link from the outcomes.
Yeah. So would you do that for yourself? Would you write down after your coaching sessions and do this kind of unpacking? Potentially at times?
I do. Well, I always make notes after every coaching conversation about where what happened in the conversation, where did we get to, what were some of the things we explored. And also, yes, some notes for me, like what are some of the things that came up that I would, that then gives me something, I guess, that calls me, invites me then to practice.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not practicing for no reason, if you know what I mean. And I can then start to think about what's a really small way in which I can bring self-validation online. Okay. And I won't start it in the coaching context. I might start it somewhere else. I might find a way where all the domains in my life where I'm not really kind of anchoring in any form of self-validation, right? And maybe as a parent, I'm also looking for validation from others that I'm being a good parent. So how can I have a small practice that says, I've been the best parent I can be today, and how can I validate myself for who I was today, or who I was able to be today as a parent? Or maybe that's sort of, not territory that we're still comfortable with. So we might try that in a different domain, but really finding ways of just practicing strengthening self-validation. One of the practices that I would offer to some clients, and again, it works for some and it doesn't work for others, is just having a bravo, Alice, looking in the mirror at the end of your day and being, bravo, Alice, just wanting to validate and appreciate how you showed up in certain ways today, right? You're acknowledging yourself. You're appreciating yourself. This is just waiting for someone else to give you the tick.
Yep.
And so little things like that. So really don't start with a big practice, start with a small practice. And then when you've done that, bring the next step to it, and then the next thing and the next thing. And then one day you wake up and you go, I didn't realize I look back 5 years ago to who I am today. And self-validation is not something that I feel like there's sufficient muscle there. It's never going to be that I completely anchor in self-validation, because development's funny. It never really works that way. But hey, I've developed a lot more skill and capacity in this domain than I used to before. So I just wanted to sort of put that as a frame around practice.
Yeah, I love that. And if I'm hearing that right, it's almost, identify what's that theme. Like in our example now, it was self-validation, where you just picked up how you're waiting for your client to validate you as a coach. And then you're taking that on as a topic of growth for yourself. Then you're starting to play with noticing where else does it show up in your life. Then you start to play with small experiments that actually strengthen that muscle in other domains of life, not necessarily in your coaching where the observation started.
That's it.
But then in that iterative small experiments kind of process, you find that, well, you don't need that as much from your clients anymore.
That's it.
As you used to. So it's almost like not looking at our growth in isolation. I'm just investing in this thing to grow myself as a coach or as a facilitator or as a leader, but actually seeing how the different domains of our lives are interconnected, and often the same theme plays out in different ways in the different roles that we play in turn in our life.
Beautiful. And I think that you'll find that those threads are rarely, compartmentalized into specific domains. Those threads will show up. If you can do enough peeling the onion around your identity. You might start with your identity as a coach, but what you're seeing are threads that also show up. They have a different expression, but they'll show up in your identity as a parent. They'll show up in your identity as a sibling. They'll show up in your identity in how you relate to your partner. And so that's actually, those are things that will serve us if we can start to unpack, recognize what they are, and just start engaging in small experiments that lead to practices. Like when I say an experiment, but it's also I'm practicing something. I'm doing something different to what I would normally do.
That's an experiment. You're trying something different than you would normally would.
And then I'm getting the feedback from that. And then I'm continuing to experiment with it. And I'm tuning into, and I might not tune into it every day, but like I said, in time, you kind of realize, oh, I've been playing with this notion of self-validation, and I've been playing with all these different ways of validating myself. And one day I wake up and realize, I notice I'm not really as anchored in that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, with that sort of framing, I guess I have practices around self-acceptance, like I was saying earlier, with sort of really sort of recognizing the voice of my inner critic, recognizing how that is not how do I hold that not as a deficiency, the voice of deficiency, but develop the capacity to say, yeah, and so that's who I was able to be in that context, and where's the growth opportunity here? And so we're really working on self-acceptance as a pathway to growth. As part of that, also working on self-compassion, because that's the other thing that I think is an important muscle for us to build, because we're working in a space that's psychologically demanding. So how can we actually work on self-compassion? Because this is, as you said, it's difficult work.
And what is the difference for you, Priya, between self-acceptance and self-compassion?
Oh, I mean, I don't know that. I think all of these,
they will be interconnected.
Treat them as separate. Yeah, we can't treat them as separate. But self-compassion, I think, requires you to bring your heart more online, to be able to sit with stuff that makes you feel really vulnerable. It's like, I want to almost say, and I'm making this up, but I almost want to say it's self-acceptance plus a very big heart. Can self-acceptance, it's just how much of my heart's online when it comes to self-acceptance, and how much.
So is it more of a cognitive act, or is it a loving act?
Yeah.
I love that. Self-acceptance plus a big heart.
And that's just what's coming up for me now. I would probably tease that apart because it's a really good question. But again, we just want to notice, I think that at least in the way that I've been trained to do this work, we work with we were trained to work with what were called vertical lines of development. So not just stages of development, but, how am I growing and evolving interpersonally? How am I growing and evolving emotionally? How am I growing and evolving somatically, morally? And I feel like there's different combinations of those that serve self-acceptance and different combinations of those that serve self-compassion. And self-acceptance and self-compassion are reinforcing as well.
Each other. Yeah. And I do want to zoom in on the idea of lines for just a moment, as you brought it into the conversation, because I think what we're also saying is this developmental continuum through the stages is really not a series of boxes that people evolve from and to. It's actually a map that describes this continuum of human growth. But if you double click on that map, if you double click on each stage of development, you'll find these threads, right? These lines of development. So then, those lines evolve asynchronously. So we might actually find that we are quite complex thinkers, but we are lacking a lot of self-awareness. And then how do we support or create those practices to strengthen our self-awareness muscle and evolve our self-awareness line?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So then
beautiful.
as a coach, as you work with yourself and, you treat yourself as the instrument, as you were saying before, you would almost work on the lines that you feel are my relationship to power, or the way I'm able to process and respond to feedback, or the way I engage with others, and collaborate. And there could be many, many lines we could look at. But then, almost what are the lines that require attention as they come out of this overall practice of just staying mindful and attuned to what it is that we're actually doing and how we're actually showing up?
And again, like if you look at the literature, there's probably 24 lines out there. For our purposes of being a more embodied developmental coach, my invitation would be, and this is again, just speaking from my lived experience, how do we start to really develop our capacities on not just the cognitive line, because I feel like we go there. We just go there.
That's a comfortable line to inhabit.
Oh, absolutely, right? What do I know? What am I aware of? I think that question is something that fuels us. And so I think we actually paradoxically want to know when we are over-indexing on that line.
I love that.
To the exclusion of other lines, because that's just so juicy for us. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's something about, do I just continue to get better and better and better and better at what I'm aware of and what I know? And, and I confine my life to that pursuit of knowledge. How can I notice when that's happening? How can I notice when my life's actually not as multi-hyphenated as it should be, that I'm actually investing so much of my life in pursuing a line versus multiple lines of development.
That whole tapestry made up of the multiple threads. What would you say, Priya, that is a line that you most often see being neglected at the detriment of, the impact you can have as a coach, if you're a coach, or a leader, or so on? Is there, maybe there's not one, but I'm just curious if you're noticing any, because I also notice a lot of us, and I include myself here, we favor the cognitive line. We like sophisticated models. We like to understand things. We like to know, to figure stuff out. And to a certain extent, self-awareness does employ the cognitive line too. You can be very aware of a behavioral pattern and not do anything about it.
That's it, right?
So is there a neglected, or are there some particularly neglected lines which you feel if we paid more attention to, that would positively impact our capacity to embody?
It's a difficult one. I don't know that I would specifically say this line or that line, because I think each of us is wired differently. And we have different, depending on our life circumstances and experiences we've had, we've kind of, each of us, grown quite differently through each of these lines. But I would say we want to kind of, at any point in time, if we want to be continuing to work on self as instrument and being more effective developmental coaches, my invitation would be to say, hey, we already do the cognitive line, but what are we embodying and practicing on the interpersonal line? A beautiful one there, for example, is, and I think this one might be really helpful for coaches, is as coaches, we are givers, and we could get a lot of juice from giving. But what am I, as a coach, how am I working with receiving?
Mm-hmm.
When am I open to receiving? Who am I open to receiving from? What am I open to receiving? What conditions need to be present for me to receive?
That hits home for me. I'm a very bad receiver. And you would say that, and it would make sense that is part of the interpersonal line. It's how are you comfortable with both giving and receiving in different relationships, different contexts of your life. Yeah.
Yeah. And how is that showing up as a developmental coach in your coaching conversations?
Yep.
Right. And so that might be something that we want to play with on the emotional line, something like that. Again, that, am I, as a developmental coach, I kind of, the maps tell me I should be really able to kind of sit with strong emotions within myself and within my client. And I have the awareness to know when my client's experiencing strong emotions. I have the awareness to know when strong emotions are coming up within me. But what am I able to, who am I able to be in that moment? What am I able to do with that? How am I embodying that capacity? That might be something that we want to play with developing, because are we just in that moment racing off to cognitive land?
Yes, because emotional land is not that comfortable to sit in.
No, right?
Yeah.
Moral line. That's another one that. Sorry, I interrupted.
No. Say about the moral line, because this is coming up quite a bit in a lot of conversations I'm having lately, where I've had questions such as, how is it possible for somebody to be super intelligent, super sophisticated, but extremely immoral in their actions and not even seemingly aware of the negative impact they're having? And to know that there is such a thing as a moral line of development where you can actually be quite a few steps behind your cognitive line that moral line, that kind of explains how those gaps in between intellectual capacity and ethical behavior can happen.
That's it, right? And history is peppered with examples, right? You think about Nazi doctors, for example, so high on the cognitive line, but where were they on the moral line? Or even in more recent history, if you think about some of the players that actively participated in the financial crisis that engulfed the world back in 2008, I think it was, the global financial crisis, right? And some of what was happening with selling mortgages that should never have been sold. I mean, so you can see how extremely capable in a cognitive sense, people who can write amazing algorithms and play investment markets and whatever you could also participate in a way that was unethical and immoral. And I think therefore we want to know that this is the thing with the map, right? Like I think that we want to know that maps are, as we were exploring earlier, quite reductionist, and we really want to know what is happening for us in these different lines, and what are some of the lines that I think if we have high cognitive, and this is just my experience, if we have high cognitive and low interpersonal development, perhaps it's easier to slide into or stay complacent with low moral development. Yeah, this is probably a whole other conversation.
I will definitely put some resources on stages and lines in the show description, in the episode description, because I think it's a really, for people who are interested in the potential of vertical development and developmental theories in general for essentially supporting human beings to grow towards more wisdom. The way to get there, not that anybody knows exactly what that way is, but we know it's messy. We know it's not one-faceted. We know there are so many threads in the way human beings grow that need to be teased apart. And for those of us who are in roles in different contexts where we support that growth for others, the responsibility to turn the mirror constantly towards us and kind of do that work is very present. And we've covered so much territory, Priya. that I would love to almost zoom out for a moment as we, near the end of this conversation, to kind of go, why? Like, what for? Why are you doing this? What are you doing it for? You were talking a little bit about your identity, and I'd love to hear, what's fundamentally driving you to put yourself through all this effort, to constantly interrogate your own thinking, your own feeling, to, call yourself out on things, and do all the work you're doing. What are you hoping?
To answer that, I would have to say I've been a student of integral theory for some decades now. And one of the things that I have come to understand is that, as people, as societies, as civilizations, in the long arc of history, we have been evolving. As you and I were talking about before this podcast, we've gone from being societies of slave owners and deep gender inequality and really stifling, unhealthy societies hundreds of years ago, to being more inclusive, being more, not that we're at gender parity, but certainly where women are today versus 300 or 400 years ago, there's been a shift. Slave ownership is illegal. And so we are evolving as societies. We have gone from treating other individuals and fellow human beings as resources to meet our own ends, to, where we have a more humane society where voices of everybody matter more than they did in the past. And so you can see that the world is evolving. Not that we've solved all our problems, but we are evolving in ways that are better and better. And for me, the idea of being a small cog in that very giant wheel that is serving the evolution of consciousness is what really gives me purpose and meaning. I don't know if that is something that will continue to give me purpose and meaning, but at this point in my identity, it continues to serve me. And so if you ask me why I do this work, I think it's just, as you said, help bring more of that wisdom online, serve that evolution that is happening anyway, but how can I participate in that more consciously? Yeah. And how can I contribute to that in a way that that I hope, serves that space.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the reminder that there is growth, that there is an evolution in our maturity, although it's so hard at times to see that. And I confess I often fall in that trap of hopelessness and anxiety and wondering what kind of a future my kid is gonna be an adult in. But yeah, it's almost like I'm taking what you're saying as this invitation, as this reminder that growing towards more wisdom, maturity, towards a higher stage of consciousness collectively is probably the only way to figure out how to solve the gnarly problems we've created ourselves, all while acknowledging we've come a long way in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And and kind of also resting in this is a journey. Like, I don't know how this continues to evolve and where it continues to go, and also it's not linear.
Yep.
That it's going to be 3 steps forward, 5 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Who knows, right? But there is a certain way in which, but the long arc is pointing towards growth.
Yeah.
And so, how do we take comfort from that? and also continue to kind of know how we serve what might evolve next.
Yeah. Oh, thank you
And
for,
so
yeah.
you go.
No,
I
you go.
I can talk about this endlessly, Alice. So yeah, no, I think that, I feel like, yeah, like you, we've covered a lot of terrain. If there are more questions, I'd be very happy to
I'll
provide.
share where people can find and connect with you, Priya. And I do have one last question as we wrap up. You've been serving the coaching profession for a few decades now, and I'd love to ask you, what's your hope for our profession? What is the role you think we can play, and what's your hope for coaches, if there's one, or opportunity you see, or
Oh my God, that is such a big question. and so, again, I can offer my, perspectives, a couple of different things maybe, because I don't know that I can answer that fully. But one sort of belief that I sit with, Alice, is really that coaching is the growth modality of our times. And now more than ever, given just the incredible complexity that we face, and the incredible challenges that we face, talk about climate change, and that's just one of 15, cosmic challenges that we're sitting with, right?
Yeah.
Like
the polycrisis, as it's often called.
And so when we think about the magnitude of the challenges we're facing and the complexity of life that we're in today, I think coaching has such a big role to play in supporting individuals navigating this space in a way that is useful, fruitful, helpful. And so my invitation to coaches is to, and I hope that coaches will continue to use the most deeply refined, deeply sort of the biggest possible meta maps of growth and evolution that they can use to support them in their work in this space. And I hope that coaches will, see the value in embodying and in being the works, because this is such an important time to be a coach. And how do we actually bring ourselves so fully to serving and supporting clients in this space that we've chosen to play in?
I'll take this away for me. How do we be the work? Knowing that perhaps what we've got to offer, which is not solutions, it's actually presence and curiosity and a facilitation of others' growth, is maybe more needed than it ever was.
Beautiful. Yeah. that resonates so much for me. Yeah.
Priya, thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your generosity. And thank you for sharing a little bit of the intricate story of how you are the instrument.
Thank you, Alice. It was such a pleasure to sort of be on this podcast, to be with you, and also to hear your stories. And I feel like I'm going to, really anchor in holding my truth tellers to account some more than they do now. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too, Priya. Thank you so much.
As always, I hope you learn and are inspired by each of these conversations at least as much as I have been, and the dialogue with Priya is no exception. There are a couple of things that have touched me in particular about this conversation. One is the idea that as a coach, and I would dare add as a leader, educator, or even parent, you are the tool of your craft. People learn and grow not so much from what you say, but from who you are when you are next to them or in front of them. So any inner work that you do, be it reflecting on your own shadow, your darker corners, or cultivating a practice of self-acceptance and self-compassion, all of this work is in the service of honing the instrument that you are. By doing the work yourself, by being willing to make yourself uncomfortable, being present with everything you feel, even that which is hard to feel, befriending your inner critic, you are in fact modeling a path for those who in turn trust you with their growth. Doing the inner work is a responsibility, a privilege, and a gift you give yourself and others. The other thing I took away from this conversation was hope. Like many around me, I often feel weighed down by the chaos of this world, caught up in catastrophic thinking. I do believe the world is in trouble, and I do believe we need to grow our wisdom fast so we can better navigate the storms ahead of us. But Priya also reminded me that the world has progressed, that we have come a long way. And while we still have a long way to go, I do believe it's important to stop and celebrate what we have already accomplished, both collectively and personally. So I wonder, what do you have to celebrate? What growth is behind you? What helped you get to where you are? Sometimes it's worth stopping and acknowledging that we have already built so much, and that may help us gather strength for the journey ahead. Priya has touched on a few interesting concepts, one of which is the lines of development, those threads hiding underneath the stages. I have included some interesting articles on lines in the show notes for those of you who might want to dig deeper. And I plan to elaborate further on this in future articles and episodes because I believe that lines are a little understood and hugely powerful aspect of vertical development. That's all from me for today, friends. Until next time, stay curious, stay conscious, and stay wise.